20 years ago, Rachel, a 21-year-old, was making the 20-minute journey to her home from her parents' house in the early hours of New Year's Day 2003. She had spent the evening celebrating at a pub with friends and family. She had stopped off at her parents' house in Hall Road, North Hull, to get changed into her trainers before making the 20-minute walk back to her flat in Sachs Court, Orchard Park. Her mother pleaded with her not to go because it was too late. But her beloved kittens, Speedy Tomato and Batman, were home alone after her boyfriend had decided to go to a party. Rachel promised to call when she got home. She never did. Rachel Moran was born on January 17, 1981, in England, and was the youngest of 4 siblings, having 2 sisters and 1 brother. They all lived together in their hometown. From an early age, Rachel developed a keen interest in music and dance, particularly ballet. She excelled academically in school and later attended a local college to study information technology. However, she eventually decided to focus on her passion for dance. In college, Rachel met a young man named Mark, and they soon started dating. They decided to move in together and rented an apartment in a quiet residential area, which was only a kilometer away from Rachel's parents' home, allowing her to visit them frequently. Rachel also found a job at a local bakery, where she enjoyed decorating cakes. This experience sparked her interest in pursuing a culinary education. In December 2002, when Rachel was 21, she and Mark adopted 2 kittens. They were both very attentive to the pets, ensuring they were never left alone for long periods. As a result, Rachel and Mark always planned their activities to ensure someone was home to care for the animals. This included their New Year's Eve plans, where Mark was to visit his parents and return in the evening, while Rachel planned to go to a bar with her brother to celebrate. On the night of December 31st, Rachel met up with her brother, and they went to a bar, joined by some friends. After midnight, Rachel and her brother left the bar and arrived at their parents' house around 1:20 a.m. Before going to bed, Rachel decided to call Mark to check on him but found he was not home. She reached him on his mobile phone, and he informed her that he was at a party with friends. Disappointed that Mark had left the house and the kittens alone, Rachel decided to go back to their apartment instead of staying at her parents' house. Her mother tried to dissuade her from leaving due to the late hour and concerns for her safety, even though the apartment was only a kilometer away. After a long discussion, Rachel left for home, promising to call her mother upon arrival. However, after waiting for about an hour and a half without receiving a call, Rachel's mother tried to reach her both on her mobile phone and at the apartment but got no response. Rachel Moran's mother grew increasingly worried when she could not reach her daughter, suspecting that Rachel might have gone to the party where her boyfriend was and hence was not answering the calls. After trying to contact her until 4:30 a.m., the mother decided to go to sleep. She woke up around 10 a.m. and found her husband on the phone, hoping he was talking to Rachel. However, it was their eldest daughter on the line, who had been unable to reach Rachel all morning and was very worried. Realizing that Rachel had not returned home, the family began to panic. They tried calling her again, and after some time, Mark answered. He was surprised when asked if Rachel was home. He said he had returned around 7 a.m. and found that Rachel wasn't there. Assuming she had stayed at her parents' house, he didn't think much of it and went to sleep. According to Mark, there were no signs that Rachel had been in the apartment. Her belongings were not there, the bed was as he left it, and the kittens had not been fed. This escalated the family's panic. The family called Rachel's friends and other relatives, but no one had seen her that night. Subsequently, Rachel's parents decided to inform the police. Although Rachel was almost 22 years old and the police might typically wait before starting a search for a missing adult, they decided to begin the search immediately in this case. They inspected her apartment and interviewed all her family members and friends. The police quickly ruled out the possibility that Rachel had left of her own free will, given her background and the accounts of her loved ones. During the investigation, Rachel's mother recalled a moment from the night Rachel disappeared. When Rachel was leaving for her apartment, they had a discussion literally at the doorstep, standing with the door open as her mother tried to convince her to stay. At one point, an unknown man passed by the street. Rachel's mother even considered asking him to accompany her daughter home, but decided against it. After receiving a basic description of the man seen near Rachel Moran's location, the police began searching for him, as he was headed in the same direction as Rachel shortly after her departure. This individual might have witnessed something relevant. Police units were alerted while the search for other clues continued. Investigators started scrutinizing Mark, Rachel's boyfriend. First, it was discovered that there had been an argument between them that night when Rachel found out he had gone to a party. Secondly, during his interactions with the police, Mark did not appear distressed despite his girlfriend's disappearance. These factors led the investigators to consider the possibility of his involvement in her disappearance, prompting them to verify his alibi. Mark stated he returned from the party after 6 a.m. The police confirmed his statement by speaking with people present at the party. Rachel's relatives also insisted that Mark would never harm her. Investigators requested Rachel's mobile operator and bank data and found that she had not used her phone or bank card since her disappearance. At that time, mobile phone geolocation tracking and cellular tower data were not sophisticated enough to be useful, especially over short distances. The police decided to obtain all surveillance camera recordings within a 10-kilometer radius of her route. Patrols were dispatched to each store, and residents in these areas were interviewed, hoping someone might have security cameras installed. Soon, they spotted Rachel on one of the cameras, just a few hundred meters from her residential complex, confirming she was heading home and not elsewhere. The search was intensified in this area, involving search dogs, helicopters, and dozens of officers combing streets, fields, and bodies of water. Streams and artificial channels were drained in the search, but these efforts yielded no results. As time passed, the police increasingly suspected that Rachel might no longer be alive, but the search continued on a larger scale. 2 weeks later, a concerning clue emerged. One of the channels near Rachel's apartment was drained, and her shoe, which she had worn when leaving her mother's house, was found. The following day, a trash bag was discovered in the same channel, containing a woman's purse with cosmetics, a mobile phone, and other items, including Rachel Moran's passport. These findings led Rachel's family and the investigators to believe she was probably deceased, and the police continued scouring the channels. There was a possibility that an unknown perpetrator had disposed of Rachel's body there, but further searches led to no additional discoveries. In the subsequent days, detectives dedicated even more effort to the case, deciding to resort to a popular tactic in England. The police found a woman who resembled Rachel Moran and dressed her in clothes similar to those Rachel wore on the night of her disappearance. They asked her to follow the same route Rachel took, and this reenactment was recorded and broadcast on local television channels. The purpose of this experiment was to find witnesses who might have seen Rachel on the night she disappeared but didn't think much of it, or had simply forgotten. The visual recreation of the scene was successful in jogging memories, and several people contacted the police with their observations after the broadcast. While these testimonies were ultimately not very helpful to the case, the detectives did gain some significant leads. In addition to witnesses, owners of surveillance cameras in the area also approached the police. Initially, the police had received most of these recordings, but some had been overlooked and proved to be fruitful. The administration of a school located about 150 meters from Rachel's apartment provided footage from the night in question. The quality was poor, but the police saw a woman heading towards the apartment complex and, seconds later, someone following her. They suspected this individual might be the unknown offender who could have attacked Rachel. However, the poor quality of the footage prevented identification of any distinguishing features. The police theorized that if the person responsible for Rachel's disappearance was this individual, they couldn't have transported her body too far without a car. They assumed the perpetrator lived in the area and decided to attempt to search every house within a 2-kilometer radius. This required residents' permission and considerable time, so over 100 officers were involved, knocking on doors and requesting to inspect properties. The search began on January 28th, with officers divided into groups, each accompanied by a specialist in property inspection. Hours into the search, one of the teams encountered something alarming at the last unit. The police were allowed inside by a man who answered the door, but initially found nothing suspicious. Before leaving, an officer noticed a small closet used for storing garbage, which was locked. The man couldn't recall where the key was, but eventually found it. When the officers opened the closet, they discovered numerous trash bags, empty boxes, and other objects. As they cleared the clutter, an officer noticed a human foot in one of the bags. Upon further inspection, they realized they had found the body of Rachel Moran. Wrapped in a blanket and tightly squeezed into the closet, which was very low, the officers were astounded at how the criminal managed to fit a human body in there. They immediately arrested the apartment owner, 23-year-old Michael Little, and his friend who was present during the visit. Little reacted calmly to his arrest, while his friend was shocked and confused about why they were being detained. After the arrest, the officers called the chief detective and waited for his arrival. They took Little's friend to the station while Little remained in the apartment with an officer, waiting for the next team. The officer decided to engage Little in conversation, and to his surprise, Little almost immediately began confessing in detail. Little expressed relief at being found, saying he had long wanted to tell someone. He narrated the sequence of events leading to the girl's death, but the officer found his version dubious. According to Little, on New Year's Eve, he saw Rachel on the street, approached her and talked to her, offering to go to his apartment. Rachel agreed, and they went to his place where they drank a bit. Then they argued over something unspecified. Little claimed he went to another room and, upon returning to the kitchen, found Rachel with her back to him, holding a knife. When she turned towards him and cut his hand, he panicked, grabbed a kitchen knife, and struck her, causing her death. The officer doubted the truthfulness of this story, as it seemed quite illogical. Nevertheless, he recorded Little's confession, and Little was soon taken to the station. During the interrogation, Little maintained his claim of self-defense. When asked why he didn't call the police, Little said he was scared and thought no one would believe him, so he decided to hide the body in his closet. Further investigation into Little's background revealed a significant criminal history. From a young age, he was caught stealing and committing other minor offenses. He was expelled from school several times, failing to obtain even a basic education. Little barely worked, stayed at home, and consumed alcohol and drugs. His acquaintances mentioned that Little often fantasized about meeting different women. He once even claimed he was dating a very tall and beautiful blonde girl. Although Little's friends knew he was not actually in any relationship, this detail caught the detective's attention. Rachel matched the description of the type of woman Little often fantasized about, approximately the same height and blonde hair. The detectives hypothesized that Little might have chosen Rachel as his victim based on these characteristics. They also established that Rachel did not know Little, despite living on nearby streets. The investigators reconstructed the timeline of that night and found that Little had been with his friends on the evening of December 31st, preparing to celebrate the new year. However, Little left their company in a rage because the girl he was trying to flirt with had left with his friend. He then headed to another party and left shortly after midnight, following a route that intersected with Rachel's path. Upon reviewing all available facts, the detectives came to an alarming conclusion. They recalled the stranger who passed by Rachel and her mother while the latter was pleading with her daughter not to walk home alone. The police suspected that this man was Little, a theory indirectly confirmed by surveillance camera footage. The recording showed a man resembling Little passing by shortly before Rachel, and in a subsequent recording, an unknown man was seen walking behind her. If this man was Little, he must have stopped somewhere to wait for Rachel to pass and then began following her. This scenario contradicted Little's own story. Further contradictions emerged after medical experts presented their report. Rachel's body had 27 stab wounds inflicted with great force, and she had no defensive wounds, contrary to Little's claim of a fight between them. Additionally, some of the wounds were inflicted from behind and no cuts were found on Little's hands. These facts unequivocally indicated that his story did not match reality. Based on all the available data, the detectives formulated a more plausible version of events. On that night, Little, feeling spurned from being rejected at the first party, passed by Rachel's mother's house. Hearing part of their conversation, he understood that Rachel would be walking home alone. She fit the type of woman he fantasized about, so he decided to attack her or try to talk to her. He advanced a bit, stepped off the main street and waited for Rachel to pass, then began following her. The situation could have developed in two scenarios. Either he attacked her immediately or attempted to flirt with her. In the scenario where Rachel might have ignored Little and walked away, there were several reasons for this. Firstly, she had a boyfriend. Secondly, she would not go to the home of a stranger who approached her on the street in the middle of the night. And thirdly, Rachel was very concerned about her kittens. Upon learning that her boyfriend had left them alone all night, she was focused on getting home as quickly as possible. The most likely scenario was that Little attacked Rachel when she was close to her home and dragged her to his apartment. Criminologists found evidence supporting this theory. There were mud stains on the back of Rachel's legs, indicating she had been dragged along the ground. They also determined that the murder did not occur in the kitchen, but in the hallway, where most of the bloodstains were found and which the criminal tried to clean. Despite all this, forensic experts determined that Rachel had been sexually assaulted, and Little's DNA was found on her body. This indicated that Rachel could have been dead by the time these events occurred. Based on all this evidence, murder charges were filed against Little on January 31st. However, he had hired a lawyer by then and retracted his initial statements, claiming he had not killed anyone. Eventually, the case went to trial in October, where Little's lawyers presented a new version of events. Little now claimed that his friend was the actual murderer. This was the same friend who was arrested with him on the day Rachel's body was discovered but was later released due to a lack of evidence linking him to the case. According to Little, he returned home early in the morning and found his friend and Rachel there. He claimed his friend had met Rachel and decided to go to his apartment because he had the keys. The three of them drank together, and then Rachel and Little went to the bedroom and had sexual relations. Shortly after, his friend burst into the room, angry, feeling sympathy for the girl, and enraged upon discovering their relationship. He grabbed a knife and stabbed Rachel multiple times, then threatened Little. Little demanded that his friend help him clean up the blood and never speak of what happened. Otherwise, he threatened to kill not only Little, but also his loved ones. As one might expect, no one believed this story. It contradicted the evidence and common sense. All indications pointed to Little as the real murderer, with no evidence implicating his friend. The trial concluded fairly quickly since the defense could not present any evidence to refute their client's guilt. As a result, Little was found guilty of murder and sentenced to life imprisonment with the possibility of parole after 25 years. If his parole application is approved, he could be released at the age of 58. Rachel's murder was a devastating blow to all her family members, but her older sister, who suffered from diabetes, was particularly affected. The stress of the situation severely impacted her health. After a long struggle, she passed away in 2010, and her family blames Little for her death as well. Thus, the actions of this criminal led to 2 tragic losses. And that's the end of today's case. As always, I appreciate your support for my work. If you subscribe, like, and share this video, it will help me continue creating content. This was another episode of Unreal True Crime. See you soon.
The horrible case of Peter Porco. Peter Porco and Joan Balzano met in college in the 70s, where he was training to become a lawyer, and she was focusing on studying to become a children's speech pathologist. The young couple was very much in love and decided to start a life together. They married in 1974, and since then, they had settled in a house in Delmar, within Albany County, where they lived for the rest of their lives. Years later, the Porco family grew with the arrival of their first son, Jonathan, in 1981, and 2 years later, in 1983, their second and last son, Christopher, was born. Peter dedicated much of his career to being a prosecutor, but in his later years, when his sons had reached adulthood, he opted for a job that would allow him to be more relaxed and enjoy free time with his wife. Later on, when his eldest son graduated as a sailor and was stationed at the base assigned to him in South Carolina, and the younger Christopher moved to the University of Rochester campus, where he studied biomedical engineering, Peter left the prosecutor's office to start working within the Court of Appeals. By the year 2000, the Porco's place was empty, yet the family never lost contact with each other, especially Christopher, who visited them more regularly because the distance allowed it. However, by the end of 2004, their relationship began to go through a rough patch when Peter and Joan discovered that Christopher was not fully committed to his studies. His grades were not good, he hardly ever attended classes, and he constantly spent time partying with his campus friends. The news disappointed his parents, and as a result, a long argument broke out among them. A week later, in the early hours of November 15, 2004, someone broke into the Porco's house, and the discussion between Peter, Joan, and Christopher was concluded forever. The clock hands pointed to 9 in the morning, marking the time Peter was supposed to go to work. An important day awaited him and his colleagues at the court. Minutes passed, but Peter did not come through the door. His boss began to worry, as it was not common for him to miss work. But if he had reasons to do so, he always notified in advance. Something was wrong, and they had to find out. They called him repeatedly by phone, but in vain. Peter did not answer. Then, his supervisor sent a court security officer to check that everything was all right at the Peter's house. The officer arrived at the place around 11 in the morning. From the outside, he could see that something was not right. The key that would open the front door was placed on the outside, but it also had a peculiar detail. It was stained with blood. Without hesitation, he called the supervisor and reported the situation. Both knew something was not right. The supervisor ordered him to enter the house in search of a concrete answer, but first he warned him to be cautious, as he did not know what he might find. Just a few steps down the entrance hallway, the officer discovered that he was inside a crime scene. The house was in disarray, and there was no corner that was not stained with blood. A massacre had occurred there. The officer reported the discovery to the police authorities, and they arrived at the scene immediately, launching a large operation at the Porco family home. The police found the place exactly as had been described in the phone call by the informant, following the bloodstains that led them to the main bedroom, where they discovered an even worse scene. On the matrimonial bed lay Joan, Peter's wife, who had also sustained severe injuries from the attacker, with the axe used as a weapon beside her. The scene was dreadful, drenched in blood, and Joan was horrifically disfigured, yet astonishingly, she was alive. Alerting the authorities with a raised hand, the paramedics swiftly transported her to the nearest hospital, despite her slim chances of survival. Her injuries were severe. Her skull was fractured, exposing her brain. Her jaw was shattered, and she had lost an eye, rendering her survival nearly impossible. In the ambulance, a case investigator seized the opportunity to question her. Aware of her surroundings yet unable to speak, Joan communicated through head movements. When asked if she recognized the attacker, she nodded, denying Jonathan as the assailant and confirming Christopher with another nod. Her repeated affirmation left no doubt. Christopher, her son, was the attacker. The paramedics, bearing witness to this critical testimony, urged caution in further questioning to prevent jeopardizing her condition. Upon arrival at the hospital, Joan underwent a 12-hour surgery, with her survival far from assured. Meanwhile, investigators, armed with the accused's identity, embarked on a thorough search for evidence to solidify Christopher's guilt. Returning to the crime scene, they meticulously examined every detail, piecing together the sequence of the attack. Initially confused by Peter's body's location near the kitchen on the ground floor, they were astounded by the autopsy results. Peter and his wife were attacked while sleeping, but surprisingly he had survived the initial assault of at least 16 axe wounds, as the injuries did not immediately end his life. Remarkably, on the morning of November 15th, around 5:30 a.m., Peter woke up as if it were any ordinary day, unaware of the gravity of his condition. He proceeded with his morning routine, washing his face and preparing breakfast and lunch for work, oblivious to the tragedy that had unfolded in his home. He wrote a check to cover the fines that his son Christopher had accumulated due to his reckless driving, and went out to the porch of his house to look for the newspaper. He noticed that the door had closed behind him, and he was locked out. Subsequently, he looked for the key he hid among the plants, re-entered the house, and collapsed. His body could no longer withstand it, so he lay down beside the kitchen. Every step, every movement Peter made that morning left large bloodstains, but he was not aware of it. The investigators learned from the autopsy that the axe had caused wounds in the superficial area of the brain, but not in the internal part, where people store activities they frequently do, explaining why he moved normally that morning. On the other hand, the police authorities discovered that the entry had not been forced and that the key they had found on the door was the one Peter had used to re-enter the house, not the attacker. Moreover, the person they were looking for knew the security alarm code that monitored the house, but had taken the trouble to destroy the device. The house was in disarray, drawers open and belongings scattered everywhere, but nothing of value was missing. It was evident that the criminal had staged the scene to simulate a robbery with a fatal outcome. This theory was confirmed when they discovered that a protective metal mesh covering one of the windows from the outside was broken. Trying to open it, they noticed it was locked from the inside and only opened a few inches, making it impossible for a person to escape through there. The attacker had managed to flee the scene without leaving a single footprint or any trace of their DNA, but was not smart enough to hide their macabre plan. It was clear that their only goal was to murder the couple, and then it was time for the investigators to prove why. While Joan fought for her life in the hospital, the police authorities met with Christopher after he contacted them to inquire about what had happened to his parents. It turned out that the youngest son had received a call from a journalist who wanted information about the case, which is why Christopher called the police to know the truth. When they finally informed him that someone had broken into his parents' house, killed Peter, and injured Joan, Christopher showed no reaction. At no point did he seem overwhelmed by the severity of the situation. This caught the investigators' attention, but they had to remain calm and agreed to meet at the hospital where Joan was recovering. There, they had a 6-hour talk in which Christopher claimed that on the night of the crime, he had fallen asleep in a common area on campus. During his statement, a patrol went to the university where the 21-year-old studied, and the officers spoke with his peers, and what they told them did not help at all in proving his innocence. His peers described him as a friendly and humble guy, even though they knew Christopher belonged to a wealthy family that could afford great luxuries. He never acted superior to others. The police were alerted by these statements, as they knew the Porco family had a good socio-economic status, but they were far from being rich. They then understood that the young man had been lying to his friends all this time. On the other hand, the young students assured that they had seen Christopher on the afternoon of November 14th, in the common area where they gathered to watch television, and also in the morning of the 15th, but he had not been there during the night by any means. Everything began to indicate that Christopher was the only suspect, but then, 3 weeks after the incident, Joan woke up from the medically induced coma she had been in, and the investigation took an unexpected turn. The crime survivor was notified about the accusation she had made against her son, minutes before being admitted to the hospital. At that moment, Joan denied what the investigators were informing her. She said it was impossible that she had made such an accusation. She didn't remember anything from that day, and it was impossible that Christopher would attack them in that way. When she regained consciousness, Joan suffered from short-term memory loss, perhaps due to the trauma she had experienced, or maybe she just wanted to defend her son. The truth was that as soon as she denied Christopher being responsible for killing her husband, the investigation abruptly regressed. Thus, the progress they had made until then was paused for a moment. The authorities were forced to consider other possible lines of investigation that did not involve Christopher, so they decided to turn the search towards Peter's job. Since the man worked in the Court of Appeals, where family cases were usually presented as part of his job, some time ago, Peter had denied a man custody of his children. The violent reaction of that individual was accompanied by murder threats directed at Peter, which numerous witnesses were able to testify. The investigators pursued this theory and met with the possible suspect. However, it turned out to be a waste of time, as the man had a solid alibi. The agents returned to Theory 1. No one knew where Christopher had been on the night of November 15th. They then reviewed the timeline in which the house alarm had been deactivated, marked around 12:15 in the morning. At that same moment, the telephone lines had been cut. Then they knew they were back in operation around 5 in the morning. Furthermore, they accessed Peter's private information, specifically his email. What they found there were clues that brought them closer to their main suspect. Once again, everything led to Christopher. A week before the murder, Peter sent an email to Christopher, informing him that he had learned from his bank that he had taken out a $31,000 loan without his authorization. The man expressed his anger and disappointment in that message for having lied to him, and warned him that if it happened again, he would have to report him. Subsequently, he clarified to his son that Joan, his mother, was worried about his actions, wanted to see him, and that whatever happened, they could solve it. The investigators had found a compelling motive for Christopher to decide to end his parents' lives, But now it was time to find concrete evidence. They went once again to the university and requested access to the security cameras, and that's how they saw the footage capturing the yellow Jeep, which belonged to the suspect, leaving the campus on the night of the 14th, around 10:30 p.m. According to the agent's calculations, if Christopher had driven on the highway, he had enough time to reach his parents' house by 2 a.m. They needed to prove that he was driving the vehicle, so they approached the toll booths on the highway that connected the university to the house in Delmar. The employees assured they had seen a yellow Jeep that night. They remembered it because it was speeding. One of the witnesses said it was a young white male, but still, a piece of evidence was missing to effectively prove it. Then, the investigators embarked on a meticulous job. They knew that those who passed through the tolls received a ticket, which they then had to present at the next one to be charged the corresponding rate. These tickets were stored in boxes by the employees, who always operated with gloves. They requested the box containing all the tickets collected that day and sent them to be analyzed, one by one, in a laboratory in order to obtain Christopher's DNA from one of them. And so it happened. One of the tickets had been handled by the boy. Everything fit perfectly. They finally had what they needed to arrest him. It took the authorities a year of investigation, and in that way, they managed to arrest Christopher Porco for murdering his father and attempting to do the same with his mother. To regain his freedom, he had to pay a bail of $250,000, which paradoxically, Joan Porco and her friends took care of collecting so that Christopher could return to his regular life. The young man moved in with his mother while waiting to stand trial. During this period, Joan continued insisting to the authorities to leave her son alone and raised her discontent in a public letter, which was released in the media. In it, she asked the investigators to stop pursuing her son and to focus on finding the real criminal. But after several more months, the time for the trial came. Christopher arrived at the venue accompanied by his mother, whom he was arm in arm with, and the round of statements began. The prosecution presented all the evidence positioning Christopher as the sole responsible for the atrocious crime, while the defense attempted to exonerate him by questioning certain aspects. On one hand, they wondered how it was possible that if Christopher had been the murderer, he left the house without the slightest trace of blood. On the other hand, they claimed he could never have driven to his parents' house because no young person has that much cash on hand to stop for gasoline and pay at the toll booths. This was because the opposing side knew very well that the boy had removed the electronic device for toll collection, using cash to avoid being tracked. As absurd as these arguments sounded, the jury still had to meet to determine a verdict, taking into account all the information provided by the investigators. Christopher had a financial motive. No one knew where he had been on the morning of November 15th, until the cameras captured him driving his yellow Jeep, and he was one of the few who knew the code to the house alarm. Additionally, one of the witnesses at the trial was his former boss, the owner of a veterinary clinic where Christopher had worked and where he had learned how to avoid being splattered with blood in surgery. The jury had no doubts at the time of their verdict. On August 10, 2006, Christopher Porco, the younger son of Peter and Joan, was sentenced to a total of 50 years in prison for the murder of his father and attempted murder against his mother. The image of a united family that the Porcos had portrayed throughout their lives ended in the past, with the terrible tragedy they went through at the hands of their youngest son. Christopher's criminal behavior, which they had kept silent and managed to hide for years, finally came to light on November 15, 2004. The whims of the boy, to be someone he was not, to invent a life he didn't have, and a social status he didn't belong to, led him to commit a series of crimes against his own parents. The fatal outcome didn't just happen. To sustain the lies he had told throughout his time at university, he repeatedly stole belongings from his parents and friends, which he then sold on the internet, where he ironically scammed people. When it was time to deliver the products, he didn't, and later he impersonated his brother's identity and used his account to tell buyers that Christopher had passed away. On multiple occasions, he forged Peter's signature to obtain loans from the bank, and so financed the yellow Jeep truck. When he had no way out, he decided to murder them to keep the money and assets of his parents. Even days before the act, he approached a financial investor for advice, as he would soon receive a large sum of money that he wanted to invest. The case of Peter Porco clearly shows how far a person lacking feelings but full of greed can go. It also highlighted the impeccable work of the investigators, who, even with the victim against them, used all their tools and even more to finally do justice for Peter Porco. This case still causes controversy within the community, with some believing that Christopher's conviction was fair, while others believe he was not the author of the terrible murder. And that's the end of today's case. As always, I appreciate your support for my work. If you subscribe, like, and share this video, it will help me continue creating content. This was another episode of Unreal True Crime. See you soon.